All right, y'all. So let's go ahead and get started with topic 7.4. We're going to talk about the economy in the interwar period. So we're going to talk about the period between World War One and the upcoming World War Two. So earlier this week, we've been working on lecture notes and videos on World War Two. What were the causes that led to World War One? What were the causes that led to that conflict, the shifting in power across the world, the causes that led up to that militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and then, of course, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand leading up to World War One. So make sure that you have your guided notes ready to go, and let's dive into topic 7.4. The learning objective in this section is to explain how different governments responded to economic crises after 1900. So our thematic focus is going to be economics. We're really going to talk about economics. What was the economy like in this period? We'll talk about the onset of the Great Depression, governments beginning to take a more active role in economic life in their countries. And then we'll also talk more specifically about the Soviet Union, which controlled its national economy through a 5-year plan and implementing other repressive policies that had negative effects on their economy. So that's what we'll dive into here in this section. Now, of course, first we want to give ourselves a little bit of context. And so we'll talk about the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28th, 1919. Now, again, we don't always want to focus so heavily on memorization of dates, but it is important to put this into context. World War One takes place between, say, 1914 and 1918. And then ultimately, we have this period of negotiation and then a treaty signed in the middle part of 1919. This marks the formal conclusion of World War One between the Allied powers and Germany. Now, remember, Germany was not the only nation fighting in World War One, fighting against the Allied powers. So, one of the most controversial and pivotal peace treaties of the 20th century, the Treaty of Versailles imposed severe reparations. Reparations really is just a big fancy word for debts that needed to be paid back. It also imposed severe territorial losses, severe military restrictions, and then severe sanctions or bans on parts of the economy that required Germany to really feel these effects of World War One. Essentially, Germany took all of the blame or most of the blame for World War One, and this has profound and lasting impacts on Germany's economy and society. The treaty required Germany to accept sole responsibility for causing World War One and to pay substantial reparations to the Allied countries. This was initially set at 132 billion gold marks. Today, if you were to kind of value that out, you'd be looking at about $32 billion. And these reparations were intended really to cover the cost of civilian damages caused by the war. The financial burden of these reparations really crippled the Weimar Republic's economy, the Weimar Republic being the German Republic. And this led to hyperinflation. So we know about inflation. We're currently experiencing inflation now due to rising gas prices and things like that. Inflation is really just when prices increase and the value of the money doesn't go as far, right? So prices in general go up. Hyperinflation is when prices are essentially runaway, going up in a runaway fashion. This was especially true in 1923. And this contributed to widespread economic distress in Germany. This obligation, this reparation, really strained Germany's economy and forced the government really to print money to be able to buy foreign money, foreign currency. And this devalued the German currency, which is called the German mark. And this led again to hyperinflation. Germany's territorial loss under the Treaty of Versailles also had a significant economic implication as well. The loss of territories such as Alsace-Lorraine to France and parts of Prussia to the newly formed country of Poland not only affected national pride and national sentiment, but it also had a direct impact on Germany's economic output. Those two regions in particular were extremely valuable industrially. They had rich coal fields, rich agricultural lands, which had contributed significantly to the German economy. So the reduction in territory meant a loss of resources, meant a lot of a loss of industrial infrastructure and agricultural land. And again, this further weakened Germany's economic position. Now, although primarily a political and security measure, the military restrictions that were imposed by the Treaty of Versailles also had economic implications. The German army was limited to only be the size of 100,000 men, and there was a ban on conscription, right? Conscription, again, is really a military draft. Germany was not allowed to force people to sign up or force them to enlist in the military. So this reduced the potential for military spending. But it also meant the loss of jobs and meant a loss of skills that were related to military industry, which affected the economy indirectly. The dismantling of the German military industry complex under the disarmament clauses led again to further economic hardships, particularly in regions that were dependent on manufacturing and industrial jobs that were related to the military. And this treaty also imposed restrictions on Germany's ability to produce and export goods, including a clause that required Germany to give the Allied countries trade advantages. So, all of these things combined with the loss of territories, and then ultimately, as we get towards the end of the 1920s, limited Germany's economic recovery after the war. The loss of its merchant fleet of ships, restrictions on the size of its navy, also really damaged Germany's trade capabilities, particularly its ability to engage in overseas trade, overseas commerce, which had been a significant source of its wealth before the war. So when we look at hyperinflation, like we said, is an economic condition that is characterized by extremely rapid and uncontrollable price increases. And this is where the inflation rate exceeds 50% per month. That means something that cost, if we were to use US terms, something that cost a dollar next month would cost $1.50. And then the following month would cost, I don't even know. I don't do math, right? But essentially, the price goes up by 50% per month. Unlike regular inflation, and right now, for example, the United States is experiencing roughly about a 3.5 percentage point inflation on a monthly basis. So you're talking about exponential rate increases. And this regular inflation can have really mild or moderate impact on the cost of goods and services. Hyperinflation really leads to a drastic decline in the purchasing power of currency as prices really rise exponentially within a very short period of time. So this phenomenon really often occurs in situations where there is significant increases in the money supply that is not supported by growth in the economy's output. The last time we got pretty close to anything remotely resembling hyperinflation is during the COVID pandemic, right? Governments were putting out lots of money into the economy, but there really wasn't a lot of economic growth or a lot of economic production because of COVID, right? People weren't able to work, weren't able to produce things, etc. So we saw inflation rates get close to 10% per month. So this is even more than what we saw during the COVID pandemic. Um, so this leads to really a mismatch between demand and supply. And Germany experienced hyperinflation after World War One, primarily due to, like we mentioned, the combination of these reparations that were imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, and also by the German government's fiscal policy. The treaty required Germany to make payments to the Allied powers as compensation for the damages caused by the war. This strained their finances, but also remember, Germany had fought a war. Nobody was helping the German economy recover after the war, other than the Weimar Republic. Um, so In an effort to kind of meet that debt, that reparation, and to cover the cost of its own post war reconstruction, the German government just began printing money, right? Just printing out dollars, printing out marks in this case, printing out money, putting it out into the economy. And this really increased the monetary supply. And this increase in the money supply was not matched by economic output, partially because, again, the war had devastated Germany's industrial capacity. There was loss of territory because of the Treaty of Versailles, which reduced, again, its productive resources. And additionally, the occupation of certain regions by the French and Belgian forces in 1923 in response to failures to keep up with those payments kind of continued to hamper industrial production, which made the economic crisis worse. So, this rapid increase in money supply led to a loss in confidence in the German currency, both domestically and internationally, causing its value to plummet, to decline. And as the value of the German mark decreased, prices for goods and services rose at unprecedented rates, which led to hyperinflation. So, this period of hyperinflation reached its peak in 1923, with prices doubling every few days. So, again, to use dollars terms here, if something cost $1 in a couple of days, it was $2. In a couple more days, it was $4, then $8, then $16, so on and so forth, right? We just double that price. Doubling is a lot easier for me for math. But this really wiped out the savings of middle class Germans, caused huge, widespread economic distress in Germany. And again, as we think about what are some of the reasons that lead up to World War II, this is going to be one of them, this economic crisis that Germany faces here in the 1920s. The chart that you see on the screen here just shows how quickly the prices of goods began to rise after World War I, which extremely rapid price increases beginning in 1922 and kind of reaching an almost vertical trajectory on the graph um, in 1923. Right as you get to the end of that chart there, you can see. Now, this slide here is really just to give you some visual to take away this story. So these are German banknotes, German marks. In the bottom left-hand corner is the 500,000 marks, right? In the bottom middle is 5 billion marks, right? A dollar bill, a banknote worth 5 billion. On the bottom right is a banknote, a paper money that was worth 50 trillion marks. The front and back pink bills that are on the top middle are 500 million marks, and the top right, front and back, are 50 billion marks. So you think about why bills of such high denominations. Imagine having a dollar bill, right? In the US, we have dollar bills. Imagine having a dollar bill that was worth 50 billion dollars, right? A single piece of paper worth $50 billion. Is it really probably worth $50 billion? Probably not. The reason why we have these huge denominations um, becoming necessary for the German government and the German economy is because smaller denominations are worthless as prices increased rapidly. People could not use literal suitcases of small denomination bills to buy bread, for example. And you can see that in the photograph there. That is just a table full of money in a market, probably to buy something very similar, right? So that is just stacks and stacks of currency that were necessary to deal with this hyperinflation. Now, what we have here on this slide is really an economic timeline of Germany between the end of World War I and then the onset of the Great Depression. So we're looking at roughly between 1918 and 1929. So that's when this post-war crisis period really is what we're looking from. The real crisis point is that period at the beginning of the decade, 1918 to 1923, a really shattered economy for Germany. The demands of the war effort had really drained the resources of Germany. Then you add on top of that the Treaty of Versailles, which imposed these harsh reparations, straining the economy even further. This immediate post war period saw shortages of goods, high unemployment, social unrest, protests, etc. The government facing these huge debts, and then these huge needs domestically to recover from the war, just again resulted to printing money to pay its bills. And again, that sets the stage for hyperinflation. By 1922 and peaking again, like we mentioned, in 1923, Germany experienced one of the most severe cases of hyperinflation in human history. This rapid increase in the money supply without, again, the backing of that economic production. And we're essentially repeating this part to you because this is definitely the key takeaway here on hyperinflation. Without that backing of economic production, led to a significant devaluation of the German mark. It was worthless. Prices soared daily, like we mentioned, in some cases, doubling every couple of days. This made folks have to really drain all of their savings accounts, drained out their incomes. This led to widespread poverty. And when you get to this point, you see inevitably social chaos. So the hyperinflation crisis kind of, again, like we mentioned, culminated and reached its peak in 1923. And this destabilized the Weimar Republic and undermined trust in this struggling democracy after the war. The hyperinflation crisis was eventually stopped by a series of stabilization methods and measures, introducing a new currency, the Rentenmark, in late 1923 that was backed by actual physical property, physical assets, like gold, for example. Those efforts were supported by the Dawes Plan in 1924, which kind of restructured those reparation debts and payments, and actually provided loans from the United States to stabilize Germany's currency and economy. So even here, you're looking at 1923, 1924, the United States realizes this is not sustainable for Germany. And if Germany isn't sustainable and isn't stable, dealing with all this social crisis, etc., that could play out for us in a negative way, and we're definitely never going to get our payments back. So these measures really helped restore some degree of stability, some confidence in the monetary system. And then, so following this stabilization, Germany enters a period of relative prosperity, relative economic growth. This is what we refer to as the golden 20s from 1924 to 1929 in the United States, in the US, and especially in US history. We also refer to this period, our period in the US lasts a little bit longer, it goes from 1920 to 1929, is the roaring 20s, right? So improvements in industrial production for Germany, an increase in foreign investment, particularly American loans, improvements in social welfare programs and things like that. But again, this prosperity is very fragile, right? Think about all the things that Germany has experienced in this few years post-war. And it's built on a very unstable foundation of short-term loans, ongoing reparation debts. And despite some of this economic growth, unemployment is still a problem. And many sectors don't ever return to the pre-war levels of success. But again, you see some folks, the photo that you see there on the screen, those are people dancing at a hotel, the Esplanade Hotel in Berlin in 1926. So Germany does start to stabilize a little bit towards the end, the back half of the 1920s. But again, still has some struggles, still a very fragile system. And unfortunately, by the time we get to the end of the decade, the end of the 1920s, Germany will not be the only one facing this very fragile economy. So the Great Depression begins in 1929 and lasts all the way through 1939 and ultimately, technically, even into the 1940s, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we get into World War II. This is the deepest and longest lasting economic downturn in the history of Western industrialized world. It has global impact, affecting not only the United States, which is where it begins, but also countries across Europe, right? The UK, France, Spain, Germany, etc. But countries in Latin America, all across Asia, right? The causes of the Great Depression are really complex and numerous, and you'll focus a little bit more on them in US history if you have not already taken it. Um, but one of the few triggers that we can focus on is the stock market crash of 1929. It's important to note, and particularly for those of you who I had for US history previously, um, the stock market crash is not the sole cause of the Great Depression. There's a lot of things, particularly in the United States, because the Great Depression starts in the United States. There's a lot of things that were going on in the American economy that led up to the stock market crash. But the stock market crash in October of 1929 is kind of the triggering event that began the Great Depression. And again, the foundation was already in place for this crash to happen. The crash wiped out millions of dollars of investment, wiped out millions of people who had been investing in businesses, led to a significant loss in consumer confidence. And then following this crash, you have waves and waves of bank failures, right? Think of the banks that are around today. Some of those survived the Great Depression, but this led to a loss of savings, led to a decrease in available credit. And as a result, consumers really started kind of hoarding whatever money they had. They reduced their purchasing, their expenditures. Businesses stopped investing, stopped hiring people. This led to a severe drop in demand and then later a severe drop in supply, increase in prices. Then you also had, particularly in the United States, drought conditions in the agricultural heartland, known as the Dust Bowl, which again is something you get into a little bit more detail in American history. But all of this then leads to protective tariffs. We know a few things about tariffs because of the most recent administration. The Smoot-Hawley tariff, in particular in the United States, leads to a decline in international trade. And this makes this global economic crisis that much worse. Now, we will go a little deeper into some specific effects of the Great Depression in the next few slides. We'll talk about the New Deal, the rise of Mussolini, but this is really just a quick general overview of some of the overarching effects that we're seeing in a lot of places in the world, not just the United States. Soaring unemployment rates, increased poverty, social unrest, political instability, the rise of totalitarian regimes, particularly when we speak of Germany. We'll talk about the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler. And then major changes to economic policies as well. So the Great Depression will be a huge impact economically, not just in the United States, not just in Germany, but around the world. So, how did the United States respond to the Great Depression? Before the New Deal, right? Before 1929, and then kind of into the 1930s until we get Franklin Roosevelt as president in 1932, the United States government really adhered to what's called a laissez-faire economic policy. Laissez-faire, we've talked about it before when we talked about mercantilism and things like that. But laissez-faire, roughly the best translation I can give you is it refers to like a hands-off approach to the economy. The government doesn't get involved. There's minimal intervention in the economy. And when the Great Depression starts at the end of 1929, you have, again, the stock market crash, bank failures, unprecedented unemployment. Those things really challenged that traditional economic sense and that really traditional economic thought process. So this economic crisis really exposed a lot of the vulnerabilities that existed in a capitalist economy and in a capitalist system, and really the inability of a hands-off, laissez-faire approach to provide the necessary relief that was needed during things like the Great Depression, during severe economic downturns. When Franklin Roosevelt is elected in 1932 and takes office in 1933, he pushes in a new deal, right? This new deal was groundbreaking. It proposed a more active role for the government in economic projects and economic management. But the New Deal is a series of public works projects, right? Building highways, building roads, building dams. If you've ever been or know anyone who's been to Las Vegas, for example, it's not far from the Hoover Dam, which is a dam that's built to hold back a river and created a huge lake to help provide water to communities in the West. But schools, right? Even some schools here in the Rio Grande Valley were built during the 1930s. And these were all ways to try to provide direct relief for the unemployed, recover the economy to some of these normal levels, reform the financial system to prevent a repeat. So Franklin Roosevelt ran on the three R's: relief, recovery, and reform. We're going to start out with providing relief to people, immediate economic action. Then we're going to work on recovery, creating programs to help restore the economy. And then we're going to start to reform it, change things so that things don't happen again. And that is Roosevelt's plan as he takes office in 1939. And as we mentioned, the New Deal is a major shift in US economic policy from laissez-faire capitalism to a mixed economy where the government really plays a significant role in regulating and supporting the economy. It introduces the concept of something called Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics is introduced into the American economic policy, and Keynesian economics is really increased government expenses, lower taxes to stimulate demand, right? Giving people more money to spend and put out into the economy. And it was the goal of this was to really help pull the global economy out of the Depression. The New Deal policies really lay the foundation, if you think about American history, to focus a little bit on US history a bit here. This really laid the foundation for what we consider to be modern welfare states. And I hate to use that term welfare state because the term welfare in and of itself has really gotten a negative connotation in more modern times, more recent times. But welfare programs were really intended to really take care of the welfare of the people, the well-being of the population. And this emphasizes the government's responsibility in ensuring the economic welfare of its citizens. So if you have family members who might have reached retirement age, they may be getting monthly Social Security checks, right? That was a great example of a social welfare program that came out of this shift in how the US government responded. Social Security was designed as a safety net for everyone and really nicely illustrates how the new government's roles in the everyday lives of Americans as a result of the New Deal. So when the elderly were no longer able to work because of their age, right? They could no longer have a job. They weren't earning money, so they were poor. And Roosevelt didn't want that. He wanted people to be able to be safe and live their life. So Social Security was payments for retired older Americans. And that is just one example of these types of programs that were to not only provide relief, but then ultimately later provide recovery to the economy. So we'll move into Italy now, and the post-World War I period in Italy is marked by significant instability, right? Economic instability, political instability, and there's a combination of things, both domestic things and international things. Italy participated in World War I, and that participation was extremely costly. So the country essentially put this on their credit card. They borrowed money to finance their war effort. So borrowing, they drained out the public money. This led to inflation because, again, they had pumped out money during the war to pay for things. But then after the war, an increase in inflation, right? Just like we saw in Germany, not as significant, not as high as Germany, because um, the government had to print money to pay off its war debt. Now, this war debt is not to like the allied countries. This wasn't a punishment as a result of a treaty, so a little bit different, but they owed money to people, right? They had borrowed money to finance. So now they have to pay those debts back. And so this inflation, just like we saw in Germany, decimates people's savings, diminishes their purchasing power. Um, you see increases in unemployment because there's no need to have people working in, say, like the military industry anymore. And then the economic recovery after the war is really slow because, again, it is a war. It is hugely disruptive, right? The war disrupts the agricultural output of Italy, the industrial output of Italy. You have lots of men who left their jobs to fight and they come back to find a lack of employment opportunities. And again, fighting a war is really destructive. So it takes time to rebuild things. The post war slump really hinders recovery of production levels to pre war. Um, then you also have returning veterans who really feel betrayed by the Italian government. The Italian government had made promises during the war. They promised to reform, uh, agricultural lands and things like that, reform things, social reforms and things like that. And those things didn't happen. So when these people come back from fighting the war, they expected things to have been done, and they hadn't, right? So they were very upset. So this dissatisfaction really contributes to the social unrest, the political extremism that Italy faces after the war. So you also see an increase in class conflict between the haves and the have-nots, if you will, the people with money and the people without money. Um, you have strikes, you have protests becoming much more common. Um, Workers demanded better wages, better working conditions. You have on the other side landowners and industrialists who don't want changes that would affect their profits. And then, actually, also, if you recall from Unit 6, when we talked about the large numbers of Italians who emigrated to the United States and to other places in the world in search of employment, well, those mass migrations before World War One led to a labor shortage in some places and in some sectors. So there aren't enough workers either. So not only are there not enough employment opportunities, but then there aren't enough workers to fill the jobs that there are, if that makes sense. It's a little complicated. Um, so these mass migrations led to labor shortages. This impacted agricultural productivity, industrial productivity, and so the war and its aftermath would see a reduction in immigration. Those who had left, the pre war migrations, had already affected the economic landscape of Italy. The war made it worse, and then the follow up was even worse than that. Um, so the regions that had experienced significant immigration before the war, particularly southern Italy, were left with really weak local economies and weak social structures. So you then start to have regional disparities. And if we want to talk about regional disparities, think of it in this term, like in the United States, we have different regions, we have different states. Some states do better economically than others, right? Sort of similar, right? But there's not a lot of sharing the wealth going around either. Um, so this creates tension. This creates dissatisfaction with the central government. And so the Italian government is really perceived to be weak, ineffective. It struggles to really address to people's satisfaction the economic and social challenges that face the country. There are frequent changes in government. There's political fragmentation, right? They don't have a two-party system like the United States does in Italy. So you have different political parties, different ruling factions. So really, you start to see what Italy faces in some cases economically is a little bit similar to Germany in some respects because of the debt and the hyperinflation and things like that. But that also then translates to a political crisis as well, similar to Germany. And what the similarity I want to draw here is that this tension, this crisis, this political crisis, this social crisis, is really fertile ground for extremist movements to grow. And when we talk about extremist movements, um, we're really speaking more about fascism. And I know that word gets thrown around a lot, particularly in the last couple of years with certain people. So we will talk about fascism here, but in this sense, we're going to talk about fascism in a historical lens. So you have the fascist movement that's led by Benito Mussolini. You also have the communist movement. We've talked about communism before as well. Both of these really gained support, promising to provide solutions to the problems that Italy faces. And that really resonates with people. When you have a group of folks who can identify the problem and claim to be the one to fix it, people are going to want to follow that. And I think, again, you can draw some parallels to modern day history, but that is a conversation for another time. So, who is Benito Mussolini? And here, yes, that is Benito Mussolini holding his favorite lion cub named Ross in 1924, or Ras, maybe. But after World War One, again, like we mentioned, Italy has significant economic challenges, debt, inflation, a sharp post-war recession. Its economy is essentially collapsing. Veterans returning to find a lack of jobs and social services. There's public discontent. The Italian government is kind of rooted in this traditional liberalism, really finds itself unable to address those things effectively, again, leading to political instability. There are frequent changes in government. And again, their system is a little bit different, right? They don't have like an elected president necessarily. They have like a parliamentary system. It's a little different. Elections can be called more frequently, things like that. So we're not going to get into those details. But if you ever studied political science in college, like it can be super interesting to study Italy. Um, but that's again a conversation for another time. Um, so frequent changes in government. You see socialist movement gaining momentum, organizing strikes, protesting, and again that scares the middle class a little bit. That scares the industrialists. That scares the landowners who feared a Bolshevik style revolution. And the Bolsheviks, again, that's something we'll talk about as well. We touch on it just a little bit in World War One. That's why Russia left the war, because of the communist revolution there. Now, Benito Mussolini, but again, I don't want to equate socialism and communism. They're not the same thing. They have similarities, but they're not the same. Um, Benito Mussolini is a former socialist turned nationalist, and we want to remember what national pride is. A nationalist is someone who believes in the greatness of their nation above any other. Right, their nation is the best. Again, we have some examples of nationalists today in popular political culture. But Benito Mussolini really capitalized on this widespread discontent. He promised stability, he promised to rejuvenate the country through the creation of a fascist state. So in 1919, Benito Mussolini founded the Fascist Party, and advocated for a strong central government, the suppression of socialism. Um, and again, socialism has somewhat evolved in what its meaning is, but um, essentially, socialism is kind of closer to communism, but not as far, if you will. Um, and Benito Mussolini also promised we're going to expand Italian territory. So it's this combination of like a really charismatic leadership style. The youth might say he had Riz in that sense, if you will. And that was very cringe of me to say Riz. But he used propaganda, right? And propaganda is really like self-promotion and promotion of this fascist state, which wasn't always true, right? It was only showing the good things. But he also used violent tactics. He had his black shirt militias, this private military force, to really intimidate his opponents, to gain people's support. And his moment comes in October of 1922, when he and his fascist followers orchestrated a march on Rome, which was a planned coup d'etat designed to force the king of Italy to hand over power. Now, the King Victor Emmanuel III, was really worried. Right, he feared that there would be a civil war. Um, and there were other conservative elites who convinced the king that Mussolini can restore order, can prevent this socialist uprising. And again, that's a huge fear for folks in Italy, this socialist uprising, because again, socialism is kind of, to some, can be considered like a lead-in to communism. So that was kind of their fear. They didn't want to turn into a communist Russia, for example. So King Emmanuel invited Mussolini to form a government. And on October 29th, 1922, Benito Mussolini becomes the prime minister of Italy, and that begins the mark of fascist rule in Italy. Prime minister is someone who is, generally speaking, a member of the government, a member of parliament. Um, Parliament being sort of similar to Congress, if you will. So the king invited Mussolini to form a government, right? And that's something that also happens in the UK as well. But here, October 29th, 1922, Benito Mussolini is now in charge of Italy and now in charge of the government, and sets about his promise to create a fascist state. So it's important here to really define what fascism is, right? And again, the word fascism gets thrown around a lot, particularly in more modern political culture. There are people who accuse, people in power to be fascists and things like that on both sides of the political spectrum in the United States. It's a little weird that they can both call each other fascists somehow. But again, conversation for another time. So, what fascism is it is a political ideology, a political belief that is characterized by a strong leader, an authoritarian leader, is extremely nationalistic and often xenophobic in nature. Again, are there parallels to be made? Sure. Xenophobic means you are, in a sense, afraid of people who come from somewhere else, who come from other countries, other cultures, other religions, other societies. Again, parallels can be made. But there's a strong emphasis on unity, a strong emphasis on law and order, the subordination of individual rights to the goals of the state. And that's where some of the comparisons in modern day don't always hold. But economically, fascism really advocates for a mixed economy. Private property exists, but the state exerts control over the economy. And again, that's where some of that comparison to modern day fascists modern day so-called fascists doesn't always hold. But the regulation of production, the regulation of distribution, the regulation of trade to serve the national interest. Um, Fascists promote the idea of corporations, corporatism, where sectors of the economy like agriculture, industry, and trade are organized into corporate associations that represent both the employers and the employees, but they're ultimately controlled by the state. So this system kind of creates harmony between workers and employers to prevent class conflict while ensuring that the activities of the economy align with the national interest as defined by the government, as defined by the regime. So again, when you hear people in popular culture today calling certain individuals fascists, it doesn't always ring true because there's not this extra part on the economy, right, to make sure that things serve the national interest necessarily in this fashion. So just keep that in mind. It's a little bit different. But again, that's a conversation more for your political science class or when you get into government, for example. So we want to reflect a little bit as well on our learning objective in this topic, right? We wanted you to be able to explain how different governments responded to the economic problems that they face after World War I. So here you have a really quick comparison of the economic policy and the government response from the United States and Italy. Now, both fascism in Italy and FDR's New Deal in the United States involved significant government intervention in the economy. FDR's New Deal maintained democratic principles, democratic, small d, democratic principles, and aimed to preserve individual freedoms and the democratic process, right? Um, in contrast, fascism imposed this like authoritarian control, got rid of political dissent, eliminated democratic institutions. Um, and so, economically speaking, the New Deal focused on relief for the poor and unemployed, focused on recovery of the economy, reforming the financial system through different programs that supported direct assistance and direct aid and economic stimulus. Fascist economies also invest in infrastructure, but they also want to control certain parts of the economy. And they do that through strengthening the power of the state, prioritizing military, prioritizing imperial expansion. Um, the New Deal wanted to kind of balance the interests of workers and employers through laws, through legislation, things like the National Labor Relations Act, which wanted to protect the rights of workers to form labor unions, to bargain. Fascism wanted to combine the interests of labor and industry to corporate structure that served the state's goals, not their own goals, the state's goals. And again, often at the expense of the rights of workers and no genuine representation. The ideological foundation, the belief system that was the foundation of the New Deal was liberal democracy, Keynesian economics, advocating for the government intervention to support social welfare, support economic welfare. Fascism is based on authoritarianism, based on nationalism, based often on racial ideology that emphasizes the supremacy, the overwhelming supremacy of the state and of the leader. So there are some similarities about increasing um, government intervention in the economy, just two radically different approaches to how that is accomplished here. And so recall from earlier in the week, from 7.1, we heard about Russia undergoing this major power shift during World War One. The provisional government that follows the abdication of the Tsar Nicholas II, was unable to really address the economic problems that Russia was facing. And so in October of 1917, the Bolsheviks successfully overthrow the provisional government, and promising peace, land, and bread. The Bolsheviks addressed the immediate concerns of the poor, the peasants, and workers, resonating with a very war weary and economically distressed population. So let's dive in a little bit more to this Bolshevik revolution, which leads Russia into becoming one of the largest communist countries in the world. So Vladimir Lenin comes to power following this October Revolution of 1917, which again is right at the tail end of World War One, and ultimately part of the reason why the United States joins World War One, is because Russia pulls out, basically, because it's facing this revolution and this crisis, and that brings the U.S. into the war to help stabilize the Allied powers, and then ultimately the Allies win. But following their seizure of power, the Bolsheviks implement radical economic policies to consolidate their control, to reshape the Russian economy. They nationalized banks, they nationalized factories, they nationalized large land estates, they placed them under the control of the state. That's what nationalizing means. Um, so this was aimed at eliminating private ownership of the means of production. So people could not own the means to produce things in the economy. Those would have to be right? The Russians wanted to ensure that industrial and agricultural output met the needs of the state and its citizens. Um, so then we see the Russian Civil War take place between 1918 and 1921. Then what would become the Soviet government adopted a policy of war communism, uh, requisitioning grain from peasants and centralizing the distribution of resources to support the army and the urban populations. So people would grow the grain and then have to send it to the government. And then the government was responsible for figuring out who got what, with the army and then the cities getting priority. And so this was effective in some aspects, right? So there are some aspects where this is effective, the communist government, in the sense during this war effort, right? But the policy leads to peasant revolts, leads to further disruption in the economy, contributed to a famine in the Ukraine where 5 million people died. And so it's in response to this economic crisis and this peasant unrest that Vladimir Lenin introduces something called the New Economic Policy in 1921. The NEP represents a temporary retreat, pullback from socialist economics, allowing for a little bit of private um, business, private enterprise, and private markets in agriculture, small scale industries to help stimulate the economy. Now, Vladimir Lenin would die 3.5 to 4 years later in January of 1924, and that left a power vacuum. And then that left a communist party that was divided over the future of the Soviet Union. The NEP was economically successful, but it was very controversial because, again, you think of communism, the goal is that the state controls the means of production and everyone, the needs of the state are met equally among everyone, which is like drastically contrasts to capitalism. The NEP was sort of a little bit of a relaxation of those communist policies. And it was successful, but very controversial, right? People didn't believe that that was true communism. It was a betrayal of socialist communist principles. So after Lenin's death, there is a power struggle, primarily between Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky, who had different views on the Soviet Union's future. Now, after that power struggle, Joseph Stalin is able to consolidate his power over the Soviet Union. He inherits a country that faces significant economic challenges. The new economic policy that Lenin put in place had sort of stabilized the economy, had led to some recovery, but it was a compromise, right, between communism and capitalism. Capitalist principles insufficient for building a socialist society, which was the ultimate goal of the socialist communists. So Stalin's response to the economic problems was a drastic shift from the NEP to a series of ambitious and forceful economic programs aimed at rapid industrialization and the rapid collectivization of agriculture. These were called 5 year plans, right? The first 5 year plan is introduced in 1928. It was designed to rapidly transform the Soviet Union from a predominantly agricultural society to an industrial powerhouse. The plans prioritized heavy industry, steel, coal, machinery, all things that were essential for a self sufficient military and economic infrastructure. The state took control of all aspects of production, shifting targets for output and directing resources to meet those goals. Right. So if your company that you owned but didn't really own the stuff to make made steel, the state would make sure you had the things to make the amount of steel that you were supposed to make. Right. To that extent. Um, the Soviet Union also wanted to adopt advanced technologies to sort of boost its industrial development. And if we think back a couple of units to Unit 5, when we talked about industrialization, and then even Unit 6 when we talk about consequences of industrialization. We've always talked about that Russia was always a little bit further behind than the rest of the West in terms of industrialization. It was always years behind. So Stalin wanted to sort of leapfrog that process, that progress, and catch up, if you will, to the Western industrialized nations. So Stalin launches a program here of forced collectivization. Private farms are merged into these large collective units and state farms. Um, Peasants work together under control of the state. The kulaks, or the wealthier peasants, are labeled as class enemies. Many are executed, deported, sent to forced labor camps as part of the dekulakization process. And the state wanted to control grain production to ensure a steady supply of food for the urban workers and to export grain to finance its projects. So these 5 year plans have huge impacts on the USSR. And if you're not familiar with what the USSR is, it's the United Soviet States of Russia, also known as the Soviet Union. So we call it both things. The Soviet Union does experience this rapid industrial growth. And by the time we get to the late 1930s, it had become a major industrial power. And that transformation was crucial for the USSR to be able to resist Nazi Germany during World War II, which we'll talk about more later on in the unit. Um, the collectivization of agriculture led to widespread famine, most notably the Holodomor in Ukraine between 1932 and 1933, which is still part of the things that people in Ukraine talk about as they fight this current war with Russia. Millions died due to starvation. Um, these aggressive policies towards the kulaks and the disruption of the traditional agricultural practice contribute a lot to these tragedies. The Holodomor in Ukraine is discussed in more detail in 7.8, which we'll get to. Um, and these economic changes really reinforced the state's control over all aspects of life in the Soviet Union. The government's power is absolute, and dissent is ruthlessly put down. The poster that you see reads, it's from a propaganda poster in 1931 that says, "The arithmetic of industrial financial counterplan, 2 plus 2 plus enthusiasm of workers equals 5." Right? Think about what the purpose of that message is. What would the message be? Right? The purpose is to inspire and motivate the Soviet workforce by promoting these goals of the 5 year plans, right? That's where the 5 comes from, right? 2 plus 2 plus the enthusiasm of workers, right? If the workers could just be enthusiastic enough, that equals that 5 year plan, right? A piece of ideological messaging to reinforce that the collective effort and the enthusiasm, the participation of the workers could achieve these ambitious industrial targets. Um, by invoking the notion of a counter plan, the poster is probably rallying workers to maybe even pass these targets that are in these plans, suggesting that exceeding expectations is within reach if workers just apply themselves, right? Um, the message, right? The equation 2 plus 2 plus the enthusiasm of workers equals 5 suggests that through this workers' enthusiasm and dedication, they can exceed the expected outcomes, right? Normally 2 plus 2 equals 4, but here the implication is if you're just enthusiastic enough, 2 plus 2 can equal 5, basically, right? The idea of collective effort, the idea of solidarity among workers, implying that unity and hard work can lead to success and the over-fulfillment of the state's economic plan. So these are the key ideas to review out of topic 7.4. We bounced around just a bit. We talked about the Treaty of Versailles and how it imposed severe economic consequences for Germany. Germany experiencing its hyperinflation. We talked about President Roosevelt, the Great Depression that would come at the end of the 1920s and into the 1930s. We talked about FDR and his New Deal and transitioning the United States away from that laissez-faire style economics to more Keynesian economics. We also talked about Italy and its post-World War I economic conditions. And we also addressed kind of the formation of the Soviet Union, the introduction of the five-year plans by Joseph Stalin, etc. So those are the key ideas to review out of topic 7.4. So that'll wrap up this topic. I will see you in the next one.